Hello and welcome to the 39th edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paul Logidici, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss what an ambassador does with Luis de Almeida Sampaio. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming in. I really appreciate it. First of all, I just want to say this is a tremendous experience. I really like the decor we have behind us, and I think that the audience is going to learn, quite a bit from what you have to say here today. So just to begin, if you want to tell the audience a little about, maybe your educational background, how did you find yourself in Prague, things of this nature.
Okay, thank you very much. So I am Portuguese. I was born in northern Portugal, the second city of Portugal, or Porto, which is very famous worldwide because it is the city that gives the name of the port wine.
Ah, okay.
The port wine, by the way, is not produced in Porto, but it is exported through Porto, and because of that, the wine got the name of the city from where it is exported. So a very old Portuguese brand, but Porto city is not only reputed because of the wine, but because it is the commercial and financial hub of Portugal. Very different from Lisbon. Lisbon, the capital city, is the administrative center of Portugal, but it is in Porto that essentially business, trade, not only wine related, but also textile, historically related, is based. It is also a city with a very long history, dating from the beginning of the second millennium of our history, and it is a very beautiful city by the sea with very nice restaurants and with imposing cultural life. So I was born there.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Coimbra to study law. Coimbra University is the oldest university in Portugal. It is one of the oldest all over the world, one of the oldest in Europe, more or less from the same period of Bologna, Salamanca, Montpellier, Paris, and other universities. It's also a very beautiful university with a fantastic library worth paying a visit. And it is in central Portugal. It is not on the coast, contrary to Porto and Lisbon. It is more or less midway between Porto and Lisbon, capital city.
And it's more in the interior of the country.
Yeah, more interior than Porto and Lisbon. It is more or less 60 kilometers away from the coast.
I was going to say I had a lot of friends who studied at the university that lived in Porto, and they went to school in the universities around it. So I've heard very good things about this city. So it's definitely a place I want to visit someday.
Yeah.
But if you
you should really visit because it is not only very beautiful, but culturally speaking, it is a very interesting town. Lives around the university. It is really Erasmus hotspot.
Ah, okay.
So many Czech students go to Portugal, go to Coimbra for their Erasmus semester or so. So I studied law there, and when I finished, I entered the diplomatic service. It was not only a coincidence that the opening to the diplomatic service happened when I finished my studies in Coimbra, but it was also a dream that I had been looking forward throughout. So it was the natural consequence of what I had studied.
Mm-hmm.
I also did a post-graduation in European history and international relations. So I entered the diplomatic service of Portugal in December 1983. So this coming December, I will accomplish 40 years of diplomatic service.
Oh, wow.
So it is a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
I served in many places. I served in Europe, in Brussels, NATO, and also European Union institutions. I went also to Bosnia, but I also served in Luanda, the capital of Angola,
Mm-hmm.
a very important country for Portugal because it was one of our most important colonies in the old days. And I was ambassador in Algiers. I was responsible for the Middle East peace process during the Portuguese presidency of the European Union. I was in the private office of the NATO Secretary General. I went to Bosnia as the NATO political advisor. I was ambassador in Belgrade. I was ambassador in Germany. I was ambassador to NATO. And now this is my final destination, my last post, and I am very happily ambassador to the Czech Republic, which is not only a very important country in Central Europe with great dynamics, politically and economic-wise, but also Prague is a fantastic city.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there, for sure.
It is an extraordinary place to live, not only culturally, architectonically, but it is also a very easy place to live. It is a very safe place, a lot of tourists, and it is really a city with joie de vivre, as the French would say. So, in a nutshell, this is what I did during the last 40 years. But let me tell you, in order to try to address the subject matter of your episode of your podcast, what does an ambassador do? There are essentially two types of ambassadors. Ambassadors that are posted in multilateral positions or in bilateral positions. It is obvious that being in the Czech Republic as the ambassador of Portugal, I am a bilateral ambassador now, meaning my concern, my job, my terms of reference are to develop, to foster, to strengthen, to deepen the relations between Portugal and the Czech Republic. So that is the meaning of a bilateral ambassadorship. Our focus is our bilateral relations. Of course, even though being a bilateral ambassador, you cannot live in abstraction of a broader context. Both the Czech Republic and Portugal are member nations of the European Union. Both Czech Republic and Portugal are members of the NATO alliance. So when I talk to my interlocutors in the Czech Republic, even though my main concern is the fostering of the bilateral relationship between our two countries, I cannot ignore the fact that we are both members of the European Union, that we are both members of NATO.
And that creates kind of this multilateral kind of association as well.
That creates a link with the multilateral association. But when I was ambassador to NATO, immediately prior to come to Prague, I was a multilateral ambassador, meaning that my job was to interact not only with all my colleagues, the ambassadors representing their countries in NATO, but also with the NATO institutions.
What would you say, I remember listening to how you have distinguished service, all around the world, whether it be multilateral or bilateral relations between Portugal and, countries and international organizations. Which of these kind of missions that you participated in would you say maybe taught you the most, or gave you some insight as to how your job is so important, and what would you say the most impactful mission that you worked in was?
It is a very good question, but also a very difficult question to answer. Trying to be very candid and very straight to the point. Being ambassador to NATO is extremely important for a country like Portugal, as it is very important for a country like the Czech Republic. The relationship between European countries and United States is key for the security of the international rules-based order. So the transatlantic relationship needs to be always nurtured, always cherished and protected in order to make sure that the United States remain also an European power. And my job at NATO was essentially to strengthen the importance of the transatlantic relationship.
No.
Because only to finish my train of thought, the enemies of NATO, the enemies of our security, the enemies of our defense, their main objective is to try to separate, to delink the two sides of the Atlantic.
I see.
Their main strategic preoccupation is to divide Europe from the United States and Canada. The friends of the transatlantic relationship need to counter that and to do exactly the opposite. Thus, the very importance of being ambassador to NATO.
Okay. I would generally agree as well. I think Europe and these two North American countries, the United States and Canada, really share this common worldview and how nations need to kind of play by a set of rules. When I had the pleasure of having the Japanese ambassador to the Czech Republic on the show, we talked a bit about the international rules-based order and how countries like, or the leadership in countries like China and Russia really seek to kind of push this rules-based international order to its limit, if not trying to break it altogether, which you've seen with the invasion that occurred a little more than a year ago now. But I guess my main question was, does each NATO country send a diplomat or a representative to the kind of NATO summits?
They do.
And this, I assume that this has the effect of, in my European integration class in the university, we learned a lot about how via the Erasmus program and many other institutions in the European Union, countries are really trying to bind themselves together. One step away from losing their sovereignty, however, really trying to ensure that the European Union does not necessarily fragment. And I would see that relationship as of the utmost importance in the coming decades. I think that it's pretty obvious the United States is shifting its focus into Asia and to counter the growing confrontation between the United States and China. And I think that Europe would do well to continue this fostered relationship with the United States, but also to kind of have the organizational and military self-confidence to defend themselves from threats emanating from their peripheries or from other powers around the world.
A lot of important points encapsulated in what you just said. Let me start by the beginning. First of all, yes, every NATO member nation has an ambassador, as a permanent representative to NATO in the NATO headquarters in Brussels, attending daily meetings of the North Atlantic Council. So what an ambassador does, supported by his or her team, is to assure the permanent representation of a NATO member nation in NATO. Then, regularly, we have meetings at the ministerial level, meaning defense ministers, in the case of the United States, obviously the Secretary of Defense, or meetings of ministers of foreign affairs, in the case of the United States, the Secretary of State. So those meetings that take place regularly, once every 3 months or 4 months, and they also meet when it is needed on an extraordinary basis, are also complemented at the very highest level meetings, the NATO summits, where heads of state and government share the table, and of course, then the defense ministers, the ministers of foreign affairs, the NATO ambassadors are the backbenchers supporting and feeding the different interventions of the NATO leaders. So it is an organization that works 24/7, and the permanent representatives, meaning the ambassadors to NATO, as I was before coming to Prague, they are there on a permanent basis, meeting almost every day. Okay? So this is how NATO works in a very summarized way. Then what you said about Japan, what you said about the rules-based order, and what you said about the relationship between the European Union or the European countries and the NATO allies that are not European-based countries. Now, Japan, as Australia, as New Zealand, as South Korea, and other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, they are extremely important players, not only now, but in the long run, because they really protect actively the international rules-based order against the challenges that international rules-based order today is faced with. And we know what are the challenges, and we know from where those challenges emanate. So it is extremely important that we keep on board, we Europeans, we NATO, the Indo-Pacific countries, like-minded, in a very constructive, permanent dialogue. Now, what you said about the United States devoting more energy, more time, more attention to the Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific region, than to the transatlantic relationship or to the Northern Atlantic region or to the relationship with Europe. There are two very important thoughts about that. First, the United States being a global power, being a superpower, obviously has many strategic interests. And those strategic interests, they impact on a global, worldwide perspective. So it is only natural that the United States projects their interests to the Pacific region, also to the Atlantic region, or to Europe. Why do we say now that the United States devotes more attention to the Pacific than to the Atlantic? And you gave the answer to that. In the long run, the challenge, I am not necessarily talking about threat. I prefer to use challenge to the United States as the leading strategic power comes from China. And China is not in the Atlantic. China is not in Europe. So it is only natural that not only, but also because of China, the United States devote more and more attention to the Indo-Pacific region. Nevertheless, we see now, unfortunately, since the 24th of February of last year, that there are concrete threats, not only challenges, but real threats to the North Atlantic security, to the European security, and the example of the barbarous invasion of Ukraine by Russia is the sheer demonstration of that. And it is very interesting because one of the results of the invasion was the reinforcement of NATO. Finland is now a new NATO member. cutting with a very long-standing neutrality policy, and Sweden is the next in line, and most probably during the next NATO summit that is going to take place in Vilnius in a couple of weeks, Sweden will join NATO.
Okay.
If Sweden will not yet join NATO formally, it will for sure also, as Finland, join NATO in the near future. So the importance of NATO was clearly highlighted by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It is also very important to understand that NATO is the only organization, even more than the European Union, that provides to its members a collective defense assurance. The famous Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the collective defense clause, means that if you are a member of NATO, you are instantly protected, because an attack on one means an attack on all. And the European Union is complementary to NATO in that dimension. When you spoke, and rightly so, about the importance of the European Union member nations having more responsibilities in what their own defense is concerned, that is absolutely true, absolutely correct, but with the proviso that the reinforcement of the European Union defense policies is done as the European pillar of NATO. So it is not in confrontation with NATO, is not as an alternative to NATO, is not as cutting the transatlantic relationship between the European continent and North American continent, but it is to reinforce that transatlantic link that we are reinforcing the European Union defense capabilities. And the invasion of Ukraine also demonstrated that. It was really a recent demonstration of the European Union and solidarity.
I guess my question would be, what can European countries specifically, what can be improved on their behalf to kind of reinforce their own defenses at the idea that, let's say, the United States is not a viable security partner at some point in the future. Given the trajectory of my country, it is certainly possible that the United States does not further involve itself or continue strengthening and deepening coordination with European countries as we begin our, and it's already in play now, but kind of this strategic pivot again to Asia. There are, in my view, there are clear inadequacies that the European Union collectively, if I'm looking at the 27 member states, the ability for these countries to defend themselves, God forbid, without U.S. influence is very lackluster at the moment. So I guess my question to you would be, given all the years of experience that you have diplomatically and even at the NATO military summits, what can be done to ensure European security? I don't want to use the word domestically, but continentally, without U.S. influence. What can these EU and NATO member states do? I mean, there's been talk of a lot of the French leadership was talking strategic autonomy. Germany had a very similar term, but it's not the same. It's kind of slipping my mind at the moment, but in some of my classes, we learned about proposals for the European defense community and a possible kind of European rapid defense force. What are your thoughts on kind of solutions of this nature?
Okay, thank you very much. That again is an extremely important and topical question that needs to be addressed in a relatively more detailed and serious way. First of all, the two legs, the two pillars, the two dimensions that you broadly mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
One being the importance of strengthening and reinforcing the European Union defense-related own capabilities, and the tendency that you describe, more present in some quarters of the political side in the United States than in others, of disengagement from the United States, not only militarily and defense related, but also in many other dimensions, a disengagement or a less willingness to get involved in situations, conflicts, problems that are outside the continental United States area of interest, and the key interests that are more and more identified with the Indo-Pacific region. So, the most important thing is to try to understand that we are not talking about two alternative or incompatible dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, yes, it is very important that the European nations, the European Union member nations, and also the European Union member nations that are simultaneously members of NATO, because as you know, not everybody inside the European Union is member of NATO,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some European NATO nations that are not part of the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So the importance of those European Union or European Union and NATO member nations or non-NATO members of the European context
Mm-hmm.
to reinforce their defense, to assume more responsibilities, to be more strategically autonomous, that is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
And there are mechanisms that are being put in place in order to achieve exactly that goal. For instance, 10 years ago, more or less 9 years ago, but it will be 10 years next year,
Mm-hmm.
in 2014, at the Cardiff, the Wales NATO summit, there was a pledge that every member nation of NATO would spend at least 2% on defense,
Mm-hmm.
and from those 2% of their GDP, 20% would need in new equipment, new technologies, new investments, in order to make sure that there was a reinforcement of the NATO European pillar.
Mm-hmm.
So that is all good, and it is extremely important
Mm-hmm.
that the European Union, NATO members pursue that line, pursue that path,
Mm-hmm.
reinforce their defenses, promote their defense-related industries, develop new technologies,
Mm-hmm.
affirm their willingness to defend themselves.
Mm-hmm.
However, that should never be pursued in detriment or putting at risk or in jeopardy the transatlantic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Because without the transatlantic relationship, the West will no longer be able to be the determinant factor in what the international rules-based
Mhm.
order is concerned.
I would generally agree as well.
What I mean by that is the United States alone, as Europe alone, they are not going to be able to uphold the international rules-based order in the medium to long term
Mm-hmm.
if they don't combine their efforts,
Mm-hmm.
if they don't jointly coordinate their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a very important dimension that you rightly pointed to, the mood in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The perspective that something is changing in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
that the United States is leaning closer to moments that were already there in the past of more isolationism
Mm-hmm.
or devoting a bigger attention and focus to other regions, that also needs to be countered in the sense that we, the friends of the international rules-based order, we, the friends of the values-based order, we, the friends of the West, we, the friends of the transatlantic relationship, we need to painstakingly convince the United States constituencies, but also the parliamentarians in Capitol Hill, academics across the board, in universities, in think tanks, in the different branches of the administration, that it is in the United States' interest to remain committed to the European security, as it is in the European interest to remain committed to the United States security. And that, if you add to that the importance of countries in the Indo-Pacific region, like, again, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, you have a very imposing critical mass of countries that abide by the values rules-based order, and that could really be a wall of protection to those that challenge that international rules-based order. And I would not limit myself to these compositions that I mentioned, meaning
there are other countries
Europe, they are in the global south. And it is extremely important if you look at countries in Latin America, in Africa, countries like India, those countries, other countries in Southeast Asia, countries that at the end of the day, they recognize that we need to protect an international set of relations that are based on rules, rules that are respected by everyone. Because the alternative to that is that you are living in a world, in a planet, in an international context that is dominated by autocratic countries.
And it's the sheer use of force oftentimes that these countries want to operate in. And I would generally agree with you that this kind of transatlantic partnership is critical for the continuation of the international rules-based order. I want to remind a lot of the American viewers here that we had a key hand in creating the United Nations, along with many other European countries and countries around the world, and it is kind of our duty to defend what we have built, whether it be domestically, with our Constitution and our laws, but also in terms of foreign relations. This UN that we have built, these international institutions that we had a hand in building, I think are incredibly important. And the United States, I would agree, should work with all of the countries that you mentioned to really uphold this system in kind of like a teamwork kind of setting. But I think it's really important that the countries that also want to work with this rules-based international order do kind of share the load in terms of defense. Specifically, the NATO countries, military spending, a lot of countries do not hit that 2% mark, and I think that is kind of not the best situation. Many Americans, this is kind of going into what you were saying about how many Americans wish to retreat from these systems that we've built. Many people say that we're overextended, and that what do these countries do for us? Many people think this way, and I think that. In terms of the greater global struggle that's going on between whether we're going to uphold these, international rules or not, it is very critical that we uphold these alliances and that we show our face and that we defend democracy everywhere. I really think that that's important. We're kind of getting, towards the end of the podcast here, but I don't know if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave the audience with, maybe for a minute or two.
Okay, thank you very much. What you said is extremely not only accurate, but also to the point of what we have been discussing here today. Let me try to summarize and to try to leave you with a final message on this. There is no alternative. I mean, either we are going to live during the second part of the 21st century under the dominant, be it benign or warlike, but the dominant overview of countries, of regimes, of governments that don't give a damn about individual freedom, about liberty, about human rights, about values that we cherish, or we are going to live in a world that is much sane in the sense of representing the international rules-based order. To achieve that latter result, we need joint efforts between all the nations that we described. It is important to recognize that European Union member nations need to do more, financially and otherwise, in order to contribute for the global defense and security. That is absolutely true. And a lot has been done, is being done, and it will bear fruits in the future. But I alert, and that would be my final reflection, especially for an US audience, I alert to the fact that these alliances are not only alliances of convenience, meaning alliances where the United States puts troops, blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot of money, but those alliances are key for the continuation of the United States as a free society, meaning that this that we are talking about is indispensable for the West as a set of values, being the most important engine of the international relations for the rest of the 21st century. There is no other alternative. And sometimes we need to remind our American friends that what we are discussing is not only a question of money, is not only a question of spending, is a question of investing in our common future rules and values based. And it is extremely important that we be very blunt and very clear. Without this transatlantic relationship intact and reinforced, the West will disappear.
Well, all I can say is that I hope that the transatlantic relationship continues to deepen and evolve under a very teamwork-minded association. And I hope that our collective future is very bright. But again, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been a very informative episode, guys. Please watch out for episode 40. And peace. Cheers.